The galaxy had its secrets. Some were locked in the depths of forgotten black holes, others buried in ancient archives that could only be accessed by those with a keen sense for danger. But none were as disturbing, as terrifying as the one whispered in dark corners of the vast, star-spangled universe, the legend of Earth's murder mittens. No one knew how it began or who first dared to utter the name. The whispers were vague, scattered across the cosmos, bouncing from ship to ship, planet to planet, until they formed a chilling refrain. It was only the humans who could wield them. And when they did, the galaxy itself trembled. One such ship, a sleek, silver crescent-shaped vessel known as the Stargazer, drifted in the void. Its crew, a mixture of humans, sentients, and machines, sat around the navigation deck, their expressions clouded with uncertainty. Above them, the holographic projection of an ancient Earth, a blue and green marble in space, flickered dimly, its once great cities now reduced to ruins. Here, the captain, a towering alien named Thorvok, rasped, his voice a mixture of awe and fear. "We've come to the source. The birthplace of the weapon." "Not a weapon," a voice from the rear of the room countered. "A tool. A tool of absolute destruction, but also of absolute control." At the table sat Dr. Lyra Voss, a human historian, a scholar who had spent years researching Earth's most forbidden secret. She was the one who had discovered the true nature of the murder mittens, an artifact that no one had dared to understand fully until now. The crew of the Stargazer had been searching for the mittens for years, following rumors and traces of their existence across multiple star systems. Many had dismissed the tales as a myth, a sort of cosmic boogeyman, a story told to keep the curious away. But not Dr. Voss. She had learned, through her relentless studies, that the legends were more than just stories, they were warnings. Thorvok's glowing eyes narrowed as he turned to Lyra, sensing her unease. "Tell us what you know, human. Why should we fear these murder mittens? What can they do?" Lyra swallowed, the weight of the question pressing heavily on her chest. She'd spent years chasing the truth, but now that she stood on the precipice of discovering it, her fear was palpable. They are ancient, older than Earth itself. Some say they were created by the first sentient species, a race lost to time, whose technology was so advanced it transcended conventional warfare. The mittens were a defense mechanism. Her eyes glanced toward the projection of Earth. They were designed to neutralize any threat, by severing the connection between the attacker and their own body. The room fell silent. The idea was almost unfathomable. How could a pair of mittens, gloves, become a tool of unimaginable power? Thorvok leaned in closer, his massive hand poised above a control panel that flickered with data. "I'm listening, human. How do these mittens sever the connection? What makes them so powerful?" Lyra hesitated, then spoke, her voice trembling with the weight of what she was about to say. "The mittens don't just sever physical connections. They sever the bond between mind and body, between life and death. A person who wears them becomes a conduit. They have the power to control the body of another, to render someone's thoughts and actions null and void with a single touch. They turn the victim into a puppet." Thorvok's eyes widened, the usual stoic expression faltering as the weight of her words sank in. He straightened, now fully focused on her. "And you think the mittens are here? On this world?" Lyra nodded slowly. "I do. And I believe the human race has been hiding them for centuries." But the crew of the Stargazer was not just made up of eager archaeologists and researchers. Among them were those with darker motivations, mercenaries and bounty hunters who had long seen the galaxy as a place to exploit for personal gain. One such figure, a hulking cyborg named Rhine, stepped forward, his robotic arm glowing with power. "I don't care about your history lessons, Doctor," Rhine growled, his voice low and mechanical. "I'm here for one thing, the mittens. If they truly hold the power you claim, then we should be using them to wipe out our enemies, every single one. The galaxy would bow before us." Lyra flinched, but Thorvok held up a massive hand, silencing the cyborg. "This is not a tool for conquest, Rhine. This is a weapon of unimaginable destruction." The tension in the room was palpable. Rhine's mechanical hand clenched into a fist, but he said nothing more. Lyra, meanwhile, struggled to contain her anxiety, her eyes darting toward the controls. The ship was getting closer to Earth. What if the mittens are just a myth? The ship's navigator, a small, intelligent insectoid named Klex, chirped from the corner of the room. "What if we've come all this way for nothing?" "Then we'll find out soon enough," Lyra said, her voice grim. "But I've seen the records, the hidden archives. The mittens are real. And they're not just any artifact. They've been passed down through generations of humans, kept in secret." Her fingers moved to a display console, typing in a string of commands. The holographic Earth began to zoom in, revealing a small, uncharted island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The coordinates were marked, precise, as though someone had gone to great lengths to protect this location. "I found it," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The location of the murder Mittens?" The crew stared at the display in stunned silence, the weight of the discovery settling over them like a cloud. "Get us there," Thorvok ordered, his voice like thunder, the command unwavering. "Now." The stargazer moved swiftly through the void, its engines humming softly as the stars streaked by in a blur of light. Lyra stood at the viewport, her face bathed in the cold light of distant suns, her mind racing. The legend of the murder Mittens, once an abstract horror whispered in hushed tones, was now a tangible reality, one that was fast approaching. Below her, the crew was already gearing up for what lay ahead. They had all heard the stories, the terrifying power of the Mittens, their connection to Earth's most shadowy histories, and the ominous warning that came with every tale. The Mittens weren't just a weapon, they were a force of nature capable of erasing free will, of rewriting the laws of existence itself. Thorvok, the towering captain, was standing in front of the holographic map, his large, webbed hands moving across the console, inputting coordinates. The island they were heading toward was in the Pacific, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and ancient barriers. It wasn't just an island, it was a trap. A final resting place for something that had once held unimaginable power. "It's almost as if the Earth knew its own future," Thorvok muttered, his voice heavy. "That this day would come. That we would come." Lyra turned, her expression dark. "This isn't just an island, Thorvok. It's a prison. The Mittens were hidden there to keep them away from the universe. There's a reason Earth buried them so deeply. Then why are we digging it up?" Ryan's voice cut through the room, his mechanical voice as cold as the metal it was made from. He was still agitated, still fixated on the idea of using the Mittens for control. Lyra knew he wouldn't rest until he had them in his hands. "Because we don't understand what they are yet," she said, her voice firm. "And the galaxy doesn't know what it's dealing with. We need to find out before it's too late." As the island's coordinates came into view, the tension in the room grew. Every person aboard the Stargazer knew that something catastrophic had been hidden on that desolate patch of Earth. The Mittens had left a trail of destruction for centuries, and now, in the cold silence of space, they were about to be unleashed once more. Arrival on Earth. The Stargazer broke through the clouds, its engines roaring as the ship descended toward Earth. Below them lay the vast Pacific, a glittering sea dotted with scattered islands. But this one was different. Lyra's eyes narrowed as the island came into full view, emerging from the mists like a dark sentinel. It was small, barely a few miles across, but dense with thick forest that seemed to swallow the light. The island was jagged, its shores lined with sharp rocks and deep, mist-filled valleys. There were no signs of life, no signs of civilization. Just an eerie, oppressive silence. Ryan was the first to speak, breaking the stillness. "It looks like no one has set foot here in centuries. Maybe they've buried more than just the Mittens?" "Keep your wits about you," Thorvok warned, his voice low and serious. "The planet's history is riddled with legends of things far worse than the Mittens. The secrets hidden here could be more dangerous than we realize." The crew members prepared to disembark, but Lyra paused, her gaze lingering on the island. She could feel the weight of its history pressing on her chest, as if the land itself was holding its breath. "There's something here," she murmured. "Something we're not seeing yet." They landed near the base of a craggy cliff, the ship's engines whirring down to silence. The crew disembarked, weapons drawn, and began to move toward the heart of the island. The air was thick with humidity, the jungle dense with towering trees and overgrown vines. The forest was eerily quiet, not a single bird or insect in sight. It felt as though the island itself was holding its secrets just out of reach. Ryan was the first to break off from the group, moving ahead with swift, mechanical precision. "I'm going to scout ahead," he called over his shoulder. "Stay close," Thorvok commanded. "This place feels wrong." Lyra glanced at the others. Klex, the insectoid navigator, was scanning the dense foliage with an assortment of sensory tools, while the rest of the crew took defensive positions. The uneasy quiet hung over them like a heavy fog, as though the very air was watching their every move. "We're getting closer," Lyra said, her voice distant as she scanned the surroundings. The record said there was an entrance hidden in the heart of the island. A cave system. "And you think this cave holds the Mittens?" Thorvok asked, skeptical but intrigued. Lyra nodded, her jaw tight. "I'm certain of it. The stories? The records are all pointing to the same place. The Cave of Shadows. Hours passed as the crew made their way through the dense jungle. Sweat beaded on Lyra's brow, her feet slipping on the uneven terrain as they moved deeper into the heart of the island. Ryan, who had been ahead, was now back with the group, his face grim. "There's something ahead," Ryan said, his voice unnervingly calm. "I found the entrance." The crew gathered around a cluster of rocks, the faint outline of a cave mouth emerging from the dense foliage. The rocks were covered in moss and vines, as if nature itself had been trying to hide the opening from prying eyes. Lyra took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. This was it, the point of no return. "Stay alert," Thorvok ordered. "We don't know what we're walking into." Lyra nodded, her hand resting on the hilt of her weapon. She had no idea what lay beyond the cave entrance, but she had a feeling that whatever was inside would be far worse than they had ever anticipated. As the crew moved deeper into the cave, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around them. The only light came from the glow of their torches, casting eerie shadows across the uneven stone surfaces. The further they went, the more oppressive the silence became. And then, suddenly, they heard it. A soft scratching sound, like something moving in the dark. The crew froze, their eyes darting around in alarm. The sound grew louder, closer. Something was down there in the darkness. Something old. Something ancient. "Do you hear that?" Klex whispered, his antennae twitching in nervous anticipation. Lyra swallowed, her heart pounding in her chest. "We're not alone." And then they found it. At the heart of the cave, nestled among the shadows, was a stone pedestal, its surface covered in strange, glowing symbols. Resting atop the pedestal were the mittens. They were unlike anything Lyra had ever imagined. The gloves were made of a strange, dark material, smooth, almost liquid in appearance, as though they were alive. Their fingers curled as if beckoning them forward. The air around them hummed with a subtle, almost imperceptible energy, like the pulse of a sleeping beast. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She had found them. But as she stepped forward to claim them, a shadow moved across the cave, and everything went black. The world around Lyra dissolved into darkness. The last thing she remembered was the cold, unrelenting pull of the cave's atmosphere, the glowing symbols on the pedestal flickering in her peripheral vision, and then, nothing. When her senses returned, the first thing she noticed was the stifling silence. The crew was gone. She was alone. Lyra's heart hammered in her chest as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. She was still in the cave, though the once pristine pedestal was now empty. The mittens were gone. Panic gripped her, but she forced it down, taking slow, measured breaths. She stood shakily, her legs weak beneath her. Her hand instinctively reached for the weapon holstered at her side, but it was gone. Everything was gone. She was disarmed. "Lyra," a voice rasped from the darkness, sending a chill down her spine. It was Thorvok, but his voice was distorted, hollow. "Where are you?" "Thorvok?" She called out, her voice shaky, but it echoed eerily back at her, as if mocking her desperation. The cave seemed to stretch on forever now, its walls pulsating with a strange energy that she couldn't quite place. The symbols had grown brighter, their glow more pronounced, almost as if they were alive, feeding off the energy of the cave itself. She moved cautiously, her steps slow as she made her way deeper into the labyrinth. Her mind was racing. The mittens were supposed to be the key to understanding Earth's darkest secrets, but they were more than that. She could feel it now in her bones. Whatever ancient force had created them had designed them for far more than simply controlling the body. The mittens were not just a weapon, they were a gateway. "Lyra," the voice came again, closer this time. "We are waiting." She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. There in the shadows was Thorvok, only it wasn't Thorvok. His massive form was there, but his eyes were blank, empty like hollow sockets. His body twitched erratically, his movements jerky, unnatural. "No," Lyra whispered, backing away. "What have you done?" The figure of Thorvok didn't respond, but its arms stretched out toward her, its fingers elongating unnaturally. She could feel the presence of the mittens even though they were no longer in sight. The power of whatever had touched him was now flowing through him, changing him, reshaping him. Another figure stepped forward from the shadows. Ryan, his hulking cyborg frame distorted and warped. His eyes were glowing, but not with the familiar cold light of his mechanical parts. No, this glow was something far more sinister, something alive. "Lyra," Ryan said, his voice warped into something deep and guttural. "We will serve." Lyra's stomach churned. The mittens. They had taken control of them. The power of the gloves had already begun to warp the minds of the crew, to turn them into puppets, vessels for the ancient power of the island. She had to act fast. But how? Get away from me? Lyra shouted, her voice cracking as she turned and ran. The cave seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the walls closing in, the shadows shifting like living things. The oppressive silence was now filled with the sound of pounding footsteps, her own and those that pursued her. She could hear their labored breathing, their unnatural jerky movements. The deeper she went, the more suffocating the air became. It was as though the island itself was alive, pressing in on her from all sides, its heart beating in rhythm with the eerie glow of the cave's symbols. Suddenly the darkness parted ahead, revealing a vast chamber, its walls lined with strange, towering structures. The air was thick with a low hum, a frequency that seemed to vibrate directly in her skull. At the center of the chamber was a massive stone altar, surrounded by intricate carvings and murals that depicted strange, otherworldly beings, humanoids with elongated limbs and glowing eyes, their faces twisted in agony. And there, at the center of the altar, was the glowing relic, the murder mittens. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She had found them. But they were no longer the simple gloves she had seen on the pedestal. They were alive. Pulsing with energy, with dark power, they radiated an aura of absolute control. Lyra, the voice came again, this time softer, almost coaxing. We are waiting. She spun around to see the crew, Thorvak, Rhine and the others, standing at the threshold of the chamber, their bodies still twitching, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their eyes glowed with the same eerie light as the mittens. They were no longer themselves. They had become conduits for the dark force that the mittens represented. No, Lyra whispered, a cold dread creeping into her chest. No, this can't be happening. Rhine took a step forward, his mechanical limbs grinding together. Join us, Lyra. Let us show you what power truly is. The words echoed in her mind, a temptation, a promise of something beyond her wildest imaginings. But Lyra knew the truth. This was not power, it was slavery. The mittens didn't give control, they stole it. They consumed the mind, rewriting it until there was nothing left but an empty shell. She had to stop them. She had to stop herself from falling under their influence. Lyra took a deep breath and stepped forward, her eyes locked on the mittens. The power they exuded was overwhelming, but she had come this far. She had to find a way to destroy them, to sever their hold on the crew, and on herself. But the mittens were already reaching out to her, beckoning her closer. She could feel their pull, the promise of absolute control, of unimaginable power. It whispered to her, filling her thoughts with dark visions of what could be, visions of a galaxy bowing before her, of power that could reshape the entire universe. She felt herself faltering, her will weakening, but then, something else. A whisper, faint but insistent. Her own voice. Don't give in. Lyra blinked, the voice of her own resolve breaking through the dark haze. The voice of who she was, who she had always been. With a burst of determination, she turned away from the altar, ignoring the call of the mittens and sprinted toward the exit. She had to escape, had to warn the galaxy before it was too late. But as she ran, a cold hand reached out from the darkness, grabbing her by the arm. It was Thorvak. Lyra, he said, his voice low and almost pleading. Don't leave. You don't have to fight it. Join us. Join the power. Lyra's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel the force of the mittens trying to pull her into their grip, but she fought back, using everything she had left to break free. She shoved Thorvak aside, her feet skidding against the stone as she sprinted toward the exit. The mittens were still out there, still calling to her. But she couldn't let them win. Section 3 builds the tension to a boiling point, revealing the true horror of the murder mittens as they begin to take control of the crew. The stakes are higher than ever, and Lyra must make a choice between power and survival. Let me know if you'd like to continue with Section 4. Lyra's breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted down the cave's narrow corridors, the oppressive darkness closing in behind her. She could hear them, the crew, her former comrades, following, their footsteps erratic and distorted, like echoes from a broken reality. The mittens had them just as they had almost claimed her. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, a chaotic storm of dread and determination. The mittens had the power to control, to twist, to obliterate the very essence of a person's will. It wasn't just a tool of destruction. It was a prison, a cage of the mind, and it was ready to claim the entire galaxy if given the chance. But she couldn't allow it. She wouldn't. As she raced through the winding tunnels, she could hear their voices, soft whispers calling her name, coaxing her to stop, to join them. Thorvak's deep voice, Rhine's cold, metallic hum. Each word was laced with that same dark promise. Power. Control. A future where nothing was impossible, where all of reality could be reshaped. Don't give in, she reminded herself, the faint memory of her own voice echoing in her mind. She rounded a corner and skidded to a halt. The path ahead had opened into a massive, cathedral-like chamber. At the far end, bathed in the same eerie glow that surrounded the Mittens, was the altar where the gloves had been placed. The symbols on the walls were more pronounced now, a pattern of flowing lines and arcs that seemed to pulse in time with the air itself. The entire cave was alive with an energy that made her skin prickle. And standing between her and the Mittens were the crew. Thorvak, Rhine, Klex, all of them, pale shadows of their former selves, their eyes now glowing with the same sinister light. Their movements were jerky, mechanical, as if their very essence had been hollowed out by the Mittens. They were no longer people. They were puppets. Lyra, Thorvak's voice was soft, pleading now, a twisted echo of his former self. Join us. You can wield the power. You can control them. She felt the pull, the temptation to reach out, to take the Mittens and bend the universe to her will. It was almost irresistible, the promise of godlike power, the ability to make every dream come true, to erase every failure, every loss. But she knew the truth now. The Mittens weren't about power. They were about control. About stripping away the very thing that made someone human, their will, their thoughts, their freedom. No, Lyra said, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. I won't let you do this. The crew twitched, their bodies jerking in unison as if responding to her defiance. But it was too late. They had already been consumed by the Mittens. She could see it now, those dark, glowing symbols weren't just carved into the stone. They were carved into the very fabric of their beings. She had no weapon, no way to fight them directly. But there was one thing she could still do. I have to destroy the Mittens, she thought, her heart pounding. I have to break their hold. With no more hesitation, Lyra darted forward, making a beeline for the altar. The moment she moved, the crew surged forward, their movements unnatural, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. But Lyra didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She had no choice but to keep running, to keep fighting. The world around her blurred as she dashed toward the glowing relic, the sound of footsteps echoing in her ears. Her hands were shaking, but she reached the pedestal, her fingers brushing the cool, slick surface of the Mittens. They were still alive, alive with the energy of the island, alive with an intelligence that reached out to her, beckoning her to embrace it. Lyra closed her eyes, her fingers curling into a fist. She couldn't let them take her. She couldn't let the galaxy fall under their control. Without thinking, she pulled a small device from her belt, a small but powerful explosive designed to detonate on impact. She had planned on using it as a last resort, but now it was her only hope. She placed it gently against the pedestal and activated it. The Mittens pulsed, their glow intensifying as they sensed the threat. For a moment, Lyra thought she could hear the distant cries of the crew, cries for her to stop, for her to join them. But they were distant now, fading as if their voices were being swallowed by the darkness. The countdown began. 5 seconds. 4. 3. And then, as if the cave itself had held its breath, the explosion erupted. The blast was deafening, a shockwave that shook the entire island to its core. The walls cracked, the ceiling trembled, and for a brief moment, Lyra felt herself being lifted off the ground by the sheer force of the explosion. The world spun, and for a heartbeat she thought she might be lost forever. But then everything went silent. When she opened her eyes, the cave was still standing, but the altar was gone. The Mittens too had vanished. The glow had faded, the oppressive hum that had filled the air was now a distant memory. And the crew, their twisted forms, were still standing, but the light in their eyes had gone. They were no longer controlled by the Mittens. They were themselves again. Thorvak blinked, his eyes clearing, and staggered back as if waking from a deep, unending sleep. Rhine's mechanical limbs twitched before finally powering down, and Klex's antennae trembled as he looked around in confusion. What happened? Thorvak's voice was hoarse as if it hadn't been used in years. Where are the Mittens? They're gone, Lyra said, her voice steady now. I destroyed them. They were never meant to be wielded by anyone. Not by you. Not by me. And certainly not by the galaxy. But why? Rhine asked, his mechanical voice trembling with confusion. Why stop us from using that power? Because that power, Lyra said quietly, her eyes somber, was never meant to be controlled. It was a prison. A trap for the mind, a trap for the soul. Whoever held the Mittens didn't control the universe. They were controlled by it. She stepped back, taking one last look at the cave, the ancient, haunted place that had held such unimaginable power. But now it was just a cave again. Silent. Empty. Forgotten. The crew stood around her, free but forever changed. They had seen the darkness of the Mittens, and though they were no longer enslaved by them, they had been marked. The galaxy had been saved, but at a cost. Lyra knew that even without the Mittens, the fear they had left behind would echo across the stars for generations. The legend of the murder Mittens would never fade, it would always be remembered. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of the universe, another force would rise, just as ancient, just as powerful. But for now the galaxy was free. And for the first time in a long time, Lyra allowed herself to hope. The end. This section wraps up the story, bringing the stakes to a head as Lyra makes the ultimate sacrifice to destroy the Mittens and free the crew. The galaxy is safe for now, but the ominous hint of future threats remains. If you have any further ideas or thoughts on the story, feel free to share.